Imagine a woman whose beauty was able to make a powerful king lose his mind. A woman who, without wanting to, found herself at the center of one of the biggest scandals in biblical history. Who was this woman who made King David's heart beat faster? And why is her story so important for understanding the complexities of human nature and divine mercy? Friends, today we're going to dive into the story of Bathsheba, a fascinating and often misunderstood figure in the Holy Scriptures. Her saga is full of drama, sin, repentance, and ultimately redemption. But what really happened on that fateful night in Jerusalem? And how did the actions of a single night change the course of the history of Israel and consequently of humanity? She played a crucial role in the royal lineage of Israel and, surprisingly, in the family tree of the Messiah himself. But how could a woman involved in adultery and tragedy become such an important piece of God's plan? Throughout this story, you will discover how God can use even our greatest failures to fulfill his eternal purposes, and how sincere repentance can transform the darkest situations into opportunities for redemption and spiritual growth. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, don't miss the opportunity to receive more content like this. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Now let's go back in time to the days of the unified kingdom of Israel and discover how the destiny of an entire nation was changed because of a king's indiscreet look. In ancient times, when the kingdom of Israel was at the height of its power and glory, there lived a woman named Bathsheba. Her name, which means daughter of the oath or daughter of fullness, carried with it a promise of greatness that she herself was unaware of. Bathsheba was no ordinary woman. She came from a noble and respected lineage. She was the daughter of Eliam and the granddaughter of Ahithophel, one of King David's most trusted and wise advisors. This lineage already placed her in a position of prominence in Israelite society at the time. In addition, Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was not an Israelite by birth, but he was one of David's mighty men, an elite group of warriors loyal to the king. Uriah's position as one of David's bravest soldiers gave Bathsheba a high social status. At that time, Israel lived under the reign of King David. David, the former shepherd who had defeated the giant Goliath, was now the most powerful monarch Israel had ever known. David was at the height of his power. He had conquered Jerusalem and transformed it into the capital of his kingdom. The tabernacle of God was established in the city, and David had expressed his desire to build a permanent temple for the Lord. Under his rule, Israel enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. However, as often happens, it is in moments of greatest success that we are most vulnerable to temptation. David, the great king, the psalmist inspired by God, the fearless warrior, was about to face his greatest battle, not against an external enemy, but against his own desire. It was spring, the time when kings go out to war. But David, breaking with custom, decided to stay in Jerusalem. Perhaps he was tired of so many battles. Perhaps he believed that his army could handle the enemies without his presence. Whatever the reason, this seemingly insignificant decision was about to unleash a series of events that would forever change the course of the history of Israel. Meanwhile, in a house not far from the royal palace, Bathsheba went about her daily routine, unaware that her life was about to become intertwined with the king's in ways she could never have imagined. One afternoon, King David got up from his royal bed. Restless and unable to sleep, he walked to the terrace of his palace, seeking the coolness of the air. From the top of his palace, the king had a privileged view of the city he ruled. As his eyes wandered over the rooftops of the houses below, something caught his attention. There, not far away, a woman of extraordinary beauty bathed. It was Bathsheba. The scriptures tell us that Bathsheba was very beautiful to behold. This description, though brief, gives us an idea of the impact her beauty had on David. The king, who already possessed several wives and concubines, was completely fascinated by this unexpected sight. At that crucial moment, David found himself facing a choice. He could have averted his gaze, respecting the woman's privacy and honoring his own marital vows. He could have remembered God's commandments, which explicitly prohibited adultery. But unfortunately, desire spoke louder than reason and faith. Instead of resisting temptation, David yielded to curiosity and lust. He sent someone to find out who this woman was. The answer came quickly. Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? This information should have been enough to deter the king. Bathsheba was not only a married woman, but the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers. However, David's heart was already hardened by desire. Ignoring all moral and ethical warnings, he made a decision that would change the course of many lives. the king sent messengers to fetch Bathsheba and bring her to the palace. We can only imagine Bathsheba's thoughts and feelings when she received the royal summons. Did she have a choice? In a patriarchal society, where the king's word was law, how could a woman refuse such a call? The biblical text doesn't give us details about her reaction, leaving us with unsettling questions about consent and power in an era so far from our own. As Bathsheba approached the royal chambers, the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. What would happen that night would change not only their lives, but would affect future generations and even the fulfillment of divine promises. Now let's see how this fateful encounter unfolded and what its immediate and devastating consequences. That fateful night, when Bathsheba entered the royal chambers, the fate of many was sealed. The biblical text, in its characteristic brevity, tells us only that she came to him and he lay with her. These few words hide an act of profound transgression against divine and human laws. David, God's anointed, the king who should have been a moral example for his people, succumbed to the temptation of the flesh. Bathsheba, whether out of fear, respect for royal authority, or perhaps even attraction, became an accomplice in this act of adultery. Sin, as always, brought with it immediate and far-reaching consequences. After that night, Bathsheba returned to her home. The biblical text informs us that she purified herself from her impurity, a reference to the purification ritual after sexual intercourse prescribed in Mosaic law. Weeks passed, and life seemed to have returned to normal. David continued in his palace, ruling Israel, while Bathsheba resumed her daily routine. However, sin has a habit of coming to light, no matter how hard we try to hide it. One day, a message arrived at the royal palace. It was from Bathsheba, and it contained only 3 words that would change everything: "I am pregnant." With this simple phrase, David's world crumbled. The king, who until then may have managed to justify his actions to himself, now found himself facing undeniable evidence of his sin. Bathsheba's pregnancy presented a huge problem. Uriah, her husband, was away, fighting in David's wars. There was no way the child could be his. Adultery, punishable by death under Mosaic law, would be exposed for the whole kingdom to see. David, in his desperation, began to plot. First, he summoned Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would spend the night with his wife. That way, the child could be attributed to Uriah. But the plan failed. Uriah, in his integrity, refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his comrades were still at war. The king tried again, intoxicating Uriah, but even drunk, the loyal soldier maintained his integrity. With each failed attempt by David to cover up his sin, the situation became more desperate. As David struggled with his failed plans, Bathsheba's belly grew. The king of Israel, the man chosen by God to lead his people, now found himself cornered by his own actions. The situation had reached a critical point. David, seeing all his plans fail, was about to make a decision that would take him even deeper into the abyss of sin. A decision that would cost the life of an innocent man and forever stain the reign of David. Despair can lead a man to commit unimaginable acts, and that's exactly what happened to King David. Seeing himself cornered, with all his attempts to cover up the adultery failing, David conceived a plan as cruel as it was ingenious. A plan that would not only take the life of an innocent man, but would also forever tarnish the reputation of the once righteous king of Israel. David wrote a letter to Joab, the commander of his armies. The content of this missive reveals the depth of the king's moral fall. Put Uriah in the forefront of the fiercest battle, and withdraw from behind him, so that he may be wounded and die. With these words, David sentenced to death one of his most loyal soldiers. Imagine the scene. Uriah, the valiant warrior, receiving orders to lead the attack against the Ammonites. He probably felt honored by the trust placed in him by the king. Little did he know that he was carrying his own death sentence, sealed by the hand of the one to whom he had sworn allegiance. Joab, obeying the king's orders, placed Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest battle. Then, in an act of premeditated betrayal, he ordered the troops to retreat, leaving Uriah exposed to enemy attack. The plan worked with terrible effectiveness. Uriah, along with some other soldiers, fell in combat. News of Uriah's death reached the palace. David, the man who had once mourned the death of Saul and Jonathan, now received with relief the news of the death of one of his most loyal servants. What a contrast with the David we knew from the Psalms, the man who cried out to God for justice and righteousness. Meanwhile, Bathsheba, now a widow, fulfilled the traditional mourning period. The scriptures tell us that she mourned for her husband. We can only imagine the complexity of her emotions at this time. Grief for the loss of her husband, guilt for the adultery, fear of the uncertain future that awaited her. It is important to note that in the eyes of the world, everything seemed to be in order. Uriah had died like a hero in battle. Nobody, except those directly involved, knew the sordid truth behind his death. David probably believed that his terrible secret was safe. But the scriptures remind us, nothing is covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. David's sin, though hidden from human eyes, was fully visible to the eyes of God. Uriah's death marks the lowest point in David's moral life. The shepherd who had once risked his life to protect his sheep from predators had now become the predator himself, sacrificing an innocent life to protect himself. This part of the story confronts us with difficult questions. How could someone so close to God fall so low? And if David, the man after God's own heart, was capable of committing such atrocities, what does that say about our own ability to fall into sin? But the story doesn't end here. God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, had not finished with David or with Bathsheba. The next chapters will show us how even the most terrible sins can be redeemed by divine grace. After Uriah's death, the stage was set for the next act of this biblical drama. The scriptures relate to us with an almost shocking brevity. When the mourning was over, David sent for her and took her into his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. This marriage, born of sin and tragedy, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of David and Bathsheba. To the outside world, it may have seemed like a noble gesture on the part of the king, taking under his protection the widow of one of his valiant warriors. But we know the dark truth that lay behind this union. Imagine the scene. Bathsheba, still mourning, being taken to the royal palace. She, who had recently been the wife of a soldier, now became one of the king's wives. Her feelings at this moment must have been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: grief, guilt, fear, perhaps even a spark of ambition fulfilled. As for David, he probably believed that this marriage would close the chapter on his sin. The child Bathsheba was carrying would now be legitimized as the king's son. In the eyes of the world, everything seemed to be in order. However, the scriptures remind us of a fundamental truth. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. This simple but powerful phrase shows us that, while David may have managed to deceive his people, he could not hide his actions from the all-seeing eyes of God. It is interesting to note that at this point in the story, there is no mention of repentance on the part of David or Bathsheba. It seems that they were both trying to move on, perhaps hoping that time would erase the memory of their sins. But God had not finished with them. The Lord, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, would not allow his chosen servant to remain in his unconfessed sin. A divine intervention was about to happen, an intervention that would shake David to the core of his being and lead him to a deep and transforming repentance. In the silence of the royal palace, where David's sins seemed to have been buried along with Uriah, God prepared his intervention. The Lord sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king with the truth of his action. This encounter between the prophet and the monarch is one of the most dramatic and powerful moments in the entire biblical narrative. Nathan, guided by divine wisdom, did not approach David directly. Instead, he told the king a parable, the story of a rich man who, having many flocks, stole and killed the only sheep of a poor man to feed a traveler. This ingenious narrative served as a moral mirror, reflecting David's own actions in a way he could not ignore. Upon hearing the story, David was outraged. His words of condemnation were swift and severe. As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. The king declared that the rich man should pay 4 times the value of the sheep, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. It was at this moment of righteous indignation by David that Nathan uttered the words that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. "Thou art the man." With this simple phrase, the veil of self-deception that David had woven around himself was brutally torn away. Nathan, speaking as God's spokesman, reminded David of all the blessings that the Lord had poured out on him, how God had anointed him king, had delivered him from the hands of Saul, and had given him the kingdom of Israel and Judah. The prophet then exposed David's sin in all its ugliness. "Why then hast thou despised the word of the Lord, to do evil in his sight? Thou hast slain Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife." Nathan's words fell on David like a hammer, crushing his complacency and exposing the true nature of his actions. For the first time since the beginning of this tragic sequence of events, David was forced to face the reality of his sin. David's response to this confrontation is remarkable for its simplicity and depth. "I have sinned against the Lord." There were no attempts at justification, no elaborate excuses, just a sincere and painful acknowledgement of his transgression. This moment marks the beginning of David's true repentance. The king, who had fallen so low, was now beginning the difficult journey back to communion with God. His repentance was genuine, but the consequences of his actions were still to come. Nathan then pronounced divine judgment. The sword would never depart from David's house. Evil would rise up against him from his own house, and what he had done in secret would be done openly before all Israel. Despite the severity of this judgment, there was also a word of grace. The Lord hath also pardoned thy sin. Thou shalt not die. The God of Israel, in his infinite mercy, offered forgiveness to the repentant king. This encounter between Nathan and David teaches us powerful lessons about sin, repentance, and the grace of God. It shows us that no one is beyond the reach of divine correction, and that true repentance always finds God's forgiveness. But the story doesn't end here. The consequences of David's sin were only beginning to unfold. David's repentance was sincere, but the consequences of his actions were not undone. As the prophet Nathan had declared, the sword would not depart from David's house, and the first blow came in a painful and unexpected way. The scriptures relate to us that the son born of the adulterous union between David and Bathsheba became seriously ill. For 7 days and 7 nights, David fasted and pleaded with God for the child's life. The mighty king of Israel, who had faced giants and conquered nations, now lay prostrate on the ground, begging for divine mercy. Imagine the scene. David, dressed in sackcloth, lying on the floor of his palace, refusing to eat or be comforted. His servants, concerned, tried to persuade him to get up and eat, but he refused. This powerful image shows us the depth of David's repentance and his despair in the face of the consequences of his sin. Bathsheba, in turn, is not mentioned during this period of affliction. We can only imagine her anguish, seeing her newborn son fighting for his life, knowing that this tragedy was a direct result of her sinful actions. On the 7th day, the child died. David's servants, fearing his reaction, hesitated to give him the news. To their surprise, when David realized that the child had died, he got up, washed himself, changed his clothes, and went to the house of the Lord to worship. This reaction by David may seem strange at first glance, but his words explain his attitude. While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, "Who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." These words reveal David's spiritual maturity, his acceptance of divine judgment, and his faith in the afterlife. Even amidst grief, he was able to submit to God's will and continue worshiping. After this period of mourning, David comforted Bathsheba. The scriptures tell us that he went into her and lay with her. From this union was born another son, whom they named Solomon. The biblical text informs us that the Lord loved him, a clear sign that, despite his parents' sin, this child was destined for a divine purpose. However, the consequences of David's sin were far from over. In the following years, his family would be torn apart by violence, betrayal, and rebellion. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. Absalom, Tamar's brother, murdered Amnon in revenge, and later led a rebellion against David himself. Each of these tragedies was a painful fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy that the sword would not depart from David's house. The king's sin had triggered a series of events that would affect not only his family, but the entire kingdom of Israel. This part of the story teaches us that while God forgives sin, the consequences of our actions often persist. It also shows us how the sin of one person can have far-reaching repercussions, affecting many lives beyond that of the transgressor. But amidst all these tragedies, we also see signs of God's grace and faithfulness. Despite David's mistakes, the Lord did not abandon him. In fact, it was through Bathsheba that God would fulfill his promise to establish David's throne forever. The scriptures reveal to us how God, in his infinite mercy, brought redemption and hope, even from the ashes of David's moral failure. The birth of Solomon marked a new chapter in the lives of David and Bathsheba. This son, born after the period of mourning and repentance, was given a special name by the prophet Nathan, Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. This name was a clear sign that God had not abandoned David or Bathsheba, but was offering a new beginning. Solomon grew up to become David's successor on the throne of Israel. Under his reign, the kingdom reached the height of its glory and prosperity. The temple that David had desired to build was finally erected by Solomon, becoming the center of worship for the people of Israel. What began in sin and tragedy was transformed by divine grace into an instrument for fulfilling God's purposes. This does not diminish the gravity of the original sin, but demonstrates the redemptive power of God. Like David and Bathsheba, allow God to redeem our failures and transform them into a legacy of faith. The saga of David and Bathsheba is more than a story of sin and its consequences. It is a narrative of redemption, a demonstration of God's unconditional love and His power to transform even our worst failures into opportunities for His glory. Did you know this story of David and Bathsheba? Comment below. And if you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. God bless you.